Welcome everyone to the fifth session on living the truth. In this one, I'm entitling Living the Truth, Accepting Everything. So this week we'll be exploring how living the truth involves accepting everything. It's an integral part of living the truth. So this is the A in the acronym RAIN that we've discussed in this group before, the acronym that's often used in meditation groups to point to a way of relating to what's happening in the world, that recognizing, accepting, investigating, and either nurturing or not seeing as not self, depending on who's teaching the acronym, that the N changes. So this is the A, the accepting part. And it can sound really simple just to hear it and say it, but it's actually I think the deepest part of the acronym, because without it, our practice cannot really, can't take hold, and it seems always confusing, and we really, the whole notion of not self isn't deepening. We're not, in fact, transcending the self if we're in not accepting ourselves the way we are and accepting the world the way it is. So as long as we don't accept everything, we sustain our separation from the whole. That's the egoic, the way, again, the egoic sustains itself through this struggling with what is. So the non-acceptance perpetuates the egoic sense of separation. So this, we can have transcended the ego in so many ways, but still be confronted with aspects where acceptance is difficult. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how acceptance of who you are. I don't want to use the word yourself because it's got the word self in it, but if I do, I'm not meaning the egoic self. I'm just meaning the mind body that's present. So in this session, I'm going to get fairly practical as well. I'm going to examine how we see what we reject in ourselves and how this impacts our behavior and views in and of the world. So remember, as I said in the email I sent out, when we fully accept who we are, then no identification with the ego remains. I hope you can really see that in your own practice. Don't take it as a slogan or just a statement to repeat, but really feel that in your practice. Fully accepting who we are means there's no identification with the ego. So if there's things that you're rejecting about yourself, look deeply. That's like a bell to look, to investigate. And when we accept fully who we are, we can also change. And I'll talk more about that, following up, famous Carl Rogers quote. The curious paradox is that once we accept fully who we are, that we can change. And when we fully accept who we are, then actions to change the world come from clarity and wisdom. So you can see how important this aspect of the practice is, starting with accepting ourselves. And the challenge is, we get sort of trapped in the same old patterns of judging. These patterns of mind, this what's what we called in a previous session, the trance of unworthiness, the trance of insufficiency. Just caging ourselves in with this self-judging narrative. But we can learn to recognize when we're doing this. As human beings, we can actually learn to recognize it. Say, there it is. There's the pattern of mind, the self-judging mind that's arising. We can recognize it when we're keeping ourselves in that rut or trapped by these beliefs and fears and resentments that may be arising. So we're not trying to judge or pull away. We're starting with just this recognizing and then accepting. And just to put it out front, it doesn't mean that we put up with harmful behavior or our own or another's. It doesn't mean we're not confirming negative beliefs that may arise, such as, we're not condoning injustice. This is not resignation. And I think this is perhaps why the word acceptance stirs up difficulties in the mind, because it's seen in this way. So I want to kind of get a little deeper, because you've probably heard that acceptance is not resignation, but really seeing and knowing that for yourself. So it means accepting absolutely everything about ourselves, just as we are, and everyone else. So I mentioned Carl Rogers as he developed the person-centered approach to therapy in the 1940s. His notions of self-examination and self-realization are similar to the Buddha's notion of realizing no self. And for that reason, I've found his teachings on self-examination can be helpful on this path. And the famous quote of Carl Rogers that I often like to share is, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change." The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. This really sums up what I'm getting at. And it's the same about everyone else and the world. So it begins with this accepting, right? The way things are in this moment. Accepting that they are as they are due to the unfolding of causes and conditions. Not due to anything that you control. It's causes and conditions unfolding. Another psychologist, I seem to be quoting a lot of psychologists tonight, which I don't usually do, but is that I like to sometimes read, at least historically I did, is Carl Jung, who some of you have likely come across. And he says, a quote of his is, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." We cannot change anything until we accept it. This is very similar. So he's taking it out beyond, the Carl Rogers notion of accepting yourself just as you are to accepting everything. And how that's integral with change, ability to change. So it goes further than freeing us to work out, to work in our inner world, but also to peace and justice in the world and harmony in our relationships. So the basis of this is love and acceptance. And it starts with totally accepting one's self. So what arises when you hear this? What arises in the mind? So I'll just pose this as a reflection, as opposed to something where I want a verbal answer. Just something to reflect inwardly. What arises in the mind when you hear like that? It starts with totally accepting oneself. Perhaps things like, how can I accept ... Why would I want to accept ... Maybe that's what arises. So the invitation is to accept that too. Yes, and perhaps especially that. And perhaps we get hung up on the word acceptance because it does have the ring of resignation, passive resignation. Could be for some of us that word. We'll get hung up on it. I remember many years, decades ago, teaching a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And the very first class, I brought in the notion of acceptance, non-judging, into the very first meditation. And a woman said, I can't accept this. Roared out of the room, and I never saw her again. So it was a lesson as a teacher, maybe not bring that into the very first meditation. It obviously has an impact on people, on the egoic mind. But that, there could be something about the word too that causes the egoic mind to react. So we don't want to get hung up on the word so much. It's kind of like, I was looking at it, thinking about it this afternoon. It's consciously knowing that this is the way it is, and it can be no other way. That's just kind of what came to me. Consciously knowing. So it's consciously knowing that this is the way it is, and it can be no other way. This moment is the way it is, and it can be no other way. When you think about it, how could this moment ever be any different than the way it is? For you and for the entire cosmos. It just is the way it is. So when we consciously know or accept, is the word I'll use, then we can be part of the causes and conditions that shift what unfolds next. Right? So if we're not struggling with the past, with what just happened, that brought this moment as it is, we're not struggling with the conditions that, causing conditions that brought that moment to occur. And by not struggling with what is, we can be part of the causative conditions that shift what unfolds next. We can be very clear and wise and present for this moment, and that can totally shift what happens next. Because we're no longer an egoic mind struggling, trying to control what has already unfolded. The present moment has already happened. So if we reject what is, we have a notion of what is, and we have a notion of what should be, and the two don't meet, right? We have this notion of what should be. So we're separate from the whole, separating ourselves out from the whole and saying, this moment is like this, but it should be like this. And I need to do something as this separate being to shift the moment. And we kind of do this as collectively. There's collective unconsciousness that's acting in the world as well. We're collectively doing this. And there's some element of perhaps our religious cultural influences that might be thinking, well, God should not have allowed this to happen. Right? And that kind of thinking can be there, even if we don't consciously recognize that kind of thinking is there. People should not behave in this way. The world should not be this way. I should not be this way. It's all arguing with what is. Carl Jung has a lot to say about this, and he, not only a psychologist, but a very spiritual being as well. In terms of accepting what is in ourselves, he talks about encountering and accepting the shadow aspects that are present in all of us. So Jung stated that the shadow is the unknown kind of dark side of the personality. And it's what we also project onto others in the world. So a perceived personal deficiency is seen as deficiencies in others and in the world. It's that notion of projection. We're mirrors of what we see on the world. And when we've dissolved aspects of the egoic mind, which we've been doing in these sessions, the shadow aspects often surface. We've talked about that. A few people have brought up, as the aspects of the ego are falling away or dissolving. These shadow aspects that I was really kind of keeping a lid on, in a sense, right? They're surfacing. They're kind of coming to the fore, and then this as people brought up, is very disorienting, disconcerting. Can cause us to judge ourselves and question the practice, because now it's the shadow side is coming to the fore. So this is why this stage of the practice, this notion of self-acceptance, is so crucial. Jung called this individuation. It's like what I've been calling dissolving the egoic self. Very similar process. And in that process, I'll quote Jung, if and when, in other words, when an individual makes an attempt to see their shadow, they become aware of and ashamed of those qualities and impulses. They deny them in themselves, but plainly see them in others, such as laziness, sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots. These are the examples he gives: carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possessions. Those are some of the examples of qualities and impulses that we might deny in ourselves, but they're present, but we see them in others. So Jung goes on to say that the dissolution of the persona, that's the falling away of the self, begins with the danger of falling victim to the shadow which everyone carries within him or her. So by accepting and acknowledging the shadow, it's no longer operating unconsciously. It's no longer hidden and surreptitiously directing our actions. So it was always there, but it was kind of just unconscious and hidden and still directing our actions in many ways, but not conscious. So we're through this process of dissolving the ego, these shadow aspects come to the surface, they're seen and they're accepted. And that's all part of the unfolding of this practice. I wanted to kind of insert that in because that has been brought up a few times by people in the group and also in emails that, I had years ago, I had somebody actually say, this meditation and this no self stuff that you're teaching me is actually really making me feel terrible. I thought this was going to make me happy and, I was going to be, enlightened and just, radiating loving kindness and compassion and equanimity, and so forth. And it's really, I'm seeing all these kind of nasty aspects of myself that's kind of bringing me down. And so that was kind of something we had to work through, is that this is all, this part of seeing this as part of the process. So loving what's there and loving life as it is. So we're embracing all aspects of ourselves, not just the positive or the more esteemable parts. That comes from self-esteem, right? We just very different from self-acceptance. We love the esteemable parts. We want to see those, but we keep the shadow, keep a lid on that. We don't want that to come out and play. Yeah, so just accepting what is. We're not saying we have to create some kind of imaginary construct of the self. Love that arises in the mind, and love that, a story about a good self or a bad self. It's simply accepting what is present inwardly. So self-acceptance and selflessness can coexist quite nicely. Right? So self-acceptance and egolessness, selflessness can coexist. It's not a contradiction. It's something I've also had to talk with people about in the past. Well, we talk a lot about self-acceptance, self-love, but I thought there was no self. There isn't a self, but there is a mind body that's present, that's conditioned. So we're accepting that as it is. So we're accepting every aspect of what's present in the mind body. I'll call that ourselves, because they're actually an expression of the one, of ultimate reality. Does that make sense? You know what I mean when I say the one? We're all interconnected. Ultimate reality, the ultimate truth is there's no separate self. We're all one whole, being parts of the whole. So we're actually an expression of this oneness, of this ultimate reality. So it enables us to be authentic, to let life live through us in an authentic way. I think I called this series Being Your Authentic Self or something when I first started it, and then I changed the title to Living the Truth. So they're really closely connected. Living the truth is living as you authentically unfold, as life living as you. So when we see that we're expressions of the divine, of God, of ultimate truth, of the absolute, however you want to phrase it, when we realize and see that we're expressions of that, we can accept ourselves fully. But if you don't see yourself as that, you see yourself as a separate egoic self, then of course we don't accept all aspects of ourselves. And this is everyone else. Everyone is an expression of truth. So this seeing that this is your true nature is also seeing that this is everybody's true nature. You can pick the worst person you can think of. I won't throw out names of these terrible historical figures like sometimes I do. But you can picture for yourself some terrible being in your own, that you see as a terrible being in your own life or in his history. And can you accept that person just the way they are, as an expression of the divine, as you are? This is a very deep teaching and this takes the notion of no self to its ultimate conclusion. So it's not about perfection or good, it's about wholeness. So it's about seeing wholeness in everything. So when we fully accept who we are, no ego remains. The ego only remains when there's something to fight against. People remember the Thich Nhat Hanh poem, Call Me By My True Names. People remember that poem. He goes through, he's basically saying, call me by my true names, the pirate, he just goes through this list of horrible things that people have done, and I am all these things. I'm the frog, I am the executioner, I am the, call me by my true names. It's part of the one. So this in a way is the fruit of realizing no self, but it's also a doorway to deepening and allowing more layers of egoic self to fall away. If you get what I mean, it's kind of like it feeds on itself. The more you see this as true in your life, the more aspects of the ego fall away. It allows the ego to loosen. While any resistance that feeds the ego is seen for what it is, as only feeding the egoic mind. And of course, you experience more love in your life when you accept, when there's self-acceptance. Jack Cornfield quote, in deep self-acceptance grows a compassionate understanding. As one Zen master said when I asked if he ever gets angry, of course I get angry, but then a few minutes later I say to myself, what's the use of this? And I let it go. Very similar to the Dalai Lama's answer to that question, do you get angry? Of course I get angry, but I don't hold grudges. So in other words, he lets it go. So if we're rejecting any aspect of ourself, then ultimate reality cannot show itself. We're simply feeding the ego, the egoic mind. So it's an obstacle to realizing truth, realizing non-duality, oneness. So it's we can get trapped in the desire for approval of others as well. Right? The self-acceptance can be, if it's based on the approval of others, then we'll always be a prisoner to the approval of others. I'll end with a quote from the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu says, care about people's approval and you will always be their prisoner. So just, I'll end it there and I'll open it up for any questions, comments, whatever's on your mind. And welcome to the people that came in during the meditation. Sorry I didn't see you right away, but I was meditating, kind of in the meditation, and I forgot to look up. But welcome. So, any questions about? I know we've had dialogues about this in the past, and this can stir up the ego. Some of these practices. Yeah, Jason.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I've actually been encountering, seeing these issues of self-acceptance and ego, and desire for control popping up in my life. And it used to be really, really bad, but it's becoming less and less over time, it feels like. But and one realization that I've made recently is that, and it reminded me when you said, the only, when you said we cannot change anything until we accept it. That's Carl Jung. When we fully accept, it's not until we fully accept who we are that we can change. That's the Carl Rogers. So if anyone has a son and you want to have a really wise son, you should call them Carl, I guess. Or daughter. It's the issue of control. And one thing that's really I felt lately is that really the only way to really actually control anything is by realizing that you have no control. It's only by letting go of the thought of control that you're able to really meet with the direct reality of things, and not all these distractions and all these thoughts. It feels similar to the self-acceptance stuff that you're talking about. And one thing that's come to mind, though, is that, so a couple of things is like just clarifying how we go about I feel like you can't really go about getting, like, trying to achieve self-acceptance. It's just kind of something that kind of just happens. So maybe if you could comment on that, maybe through practice of meditation and stuff, it just kind of maybe like tenderizes things a little bit and allows self-acceptance to kind of arise, because we don't really, we don't really control anything. So it's just going to kind of arise, which is the nature of the universe. Things just arise. I feel like, anyways. And so how do we go about kind of working this self-acceptance stuff? And the other thing was, I was thinking about moments when we require the ego to actually survive. Like, say a car is going down the road and I'm like standing there. And so I have to actually have an ego at that moment. Otherwise, I'm just like, I'm not going to think that I'm anything, and I'll just get run over. And I feel like that's, you're still able to do that and not identify with the ego. You know, you just kind of allow ego, or you're not even allowing it. Ego just arises in that moment to survive, allow you to survive. If it doesn't arise, then you're going to die. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on those things.
Yeah, maybe the second one first, because it's a little easier than the first one, so I'll let the first one percolate. Yeah, we don't want to get rid of the ego. It's not a matter of getting rid of these automatic processes that go on in the body that, you know, that are essential to survival. Right? Like, there's so much that's happening that makes your heart beat, that, you know, make breathing occur, and all these automated bodily processes that are part of the mind body, that of course we would not be able to, we wouldn't survive without them. If you had to control any organ in your body for a millisecond, you would just die in that millisecond, because you wouldn't be able to get all the variables correct. So there's all these automated processes, and jumping out of the way of a car is a perfectly good one. That automated survival reaction to jump out of the way. So yeah, we need we need that mind body aspect to survive. So we're not trying to get rid of the ego. We're just seeing that it's not who we truly are. It's not the essence of our being. It's not, because with that survival mode, we can get the impression that we are separate. So it's really it's seeing through the misperception of separateness, that this mind body is somehow separate from the whole. That's the misperception. So when I say living the truth, it's living the truth that we are not separate. The ego is still operating in that sense of, you know, automated, the processes that are automated in the body, there are survival reactions and so on. It's all operating, but it's part of the whole. So that one's a little easier to answer than the first one, which actually I've actually forgotten now. I said I was going to let it percolate. Now I've forgotten what it was. Can you repeat the first?
It was about how do we go about bringing more self-acceptance, or it's really hard to find the right language, right? Because it's self-acceptance just arises. We don't control our own self-acceptance. So just commenting on that.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the whole notion of manipulating our environment to be more self-acceptance would just be more struggling with what is. So if there isn't self-acceptance, isn't that what is? So you're accepting that there isn't self-acceptance. Yeah. You're accepting resistance to acceptance. You're accepting, rejecting. So there's no struggle with what is, which it is accepting. You've heard the phrase, don't judge the judging. Well, it's really pointing to that, not to that aspect of it. It's accepting. I think I used the word totally everything, including any egoic resistance to the notion of accepting. You're also accepting that. That's very important. Because if you think self-acceptance is rejecting any judgment, then you're just creating another layer of struggle. So it's not about rejecting judgment. It's about recognizing what's happening right now in this moment and accepting that that's it, what's happening. Allowing, consciously knowing what's arising in this moment, whether it be, whatever it might be, judging, rejecting. So that's very, very crucial, because we're not in control of what's arising moment by moment, as you so rightly said. And by recognizing that we're not in control, we have a profound clarity and wisdom in our actions that come next. And that can sound like control, but it's not, because you're one with what's unfolding. So by being one with unfolding, there is repercussions, there is ripple effects. Hearing this Dharma talk will have ripple effects, because it's shifting the causes and conditions that are going to arise in each of your lives. So when you accept what is in the moment, it also has a ripple effect in what happens in the next moment. It's not control as we typically define it, but a profound responsibility. There's a profound social responsibility in what we do in each moment, even though we're not in control of anything. It can sound like a complete contradiction, but it's not when you really start to kind of live it and see it. You see, oh, okay, I'm not in control of anything that's happening, but there's a profound social responsibility, because my understanding of that has a deep effect on what happens next in around me, or anything that you may affect. And not only what you have an effect on a person next to you, who then has an effect on the person next to them, who has an effect when they go home and sees their people in there. And it's just, you can see how, they often say, a smile, passing someone on the sidewalk and smiling can have an unimaginable impact, just because of that ripple effect of causes and conditions that it can create. I hope I'm making myself clear with that.
And yet it's all simply arising too. It's just a kind of natural unfolding. Is that right? Is that correct? It's, even though we're not really in control, we're not in control. It's like we're just observing the natural unfolding. Is that kind of recognizing it and accepting that natural unfolding kind of allows us to have this direct, and it's not us, it's not me having this, it allows that direct connecting almost with the present moment, and then things can kind of shift from there. Like it allows that those ripple effects, like you said. Is that kind of it? I'm asking you to put words into things that can't really, there really are no words for, I feel like, but I'm sure you have some comments.
Yeah.
I won't say anything else because I want to hear what other people have to say too. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Yeah, we're more than passive observers because we're part of the whole. So that's important. I think, we can, if we hang on the notion of we're not in control of anything, everything's just unfolding, then life can feel very meaningless. What we do isn't important. But since we're part of the whole, what we do is extremely important. And there's a deep responsibility for what we do moment by moment. And that those two can sound like, as I said, contradictory, but they're not. It's something you may have to really be present for in your life, to see that you're not in control of what's happening moment by moment. And if you think you are, we've gone over this many, many times, it's the ego thinking that it can as a separate being, if it just thinks enough, that tends to be the Western way. If we just think enough, we can make sure that shit doesn't happen, right? If I'm thinking when I'm in the shower, if I'm thinking about what could go wrong while I'm having my tea, if I'm thinking about what could go wrong while I'm driving my car, if in the middle of the night, perhaps I wake up and think about what could go wrong in the morning, then I can control enough variables and limit the amount that can go wrong. And you actually prevent a few disasters, so it reinforces that whole notion. Right? You think, oh yeah, that thinking made me not do that or prevented that. So this actually works. But you discount the other 99 times that all that thinking just caused tension and actually resulted in nothing. So we're not in control, and that's the ego doesn't like hearing that, because that's what it does. But we're extreme. And we should do perhaps another talk on this. The whole notion of I don't know what I'll call it, like spiritual responsibility. There's a real deep responsibility that comes from the practice. That means it's not meaningless. What you do is not meaningless. It's not important. It's extremely important. And you can see how what you do that arises from a sense of wholeness, and what you do that arises from that moment of clarity and wisdom has these ripple effects in the world. Why the Buddha talked about right speech, right action. Then these flow naturally from the notion of accepting. What is in the moment. Yeah, Maureen.
Yes, I've just been thinking about art and creativity and how they fit into the whole concept of the non-self. I paint, and you know, my painting isn't like anybody else's. It's a product that comes from my mind body, I guess, but I find it hard to separate that creative activity from the concept of ego. Perhaps you could comment on that.
That's a wonderful question. In fact, your question last week spurred a lot of the talk this week, and that question might spur a talk for next week, because from that place of acceptance, accepting what is, creativity can really flow out. It's not constrained by approval or thinking how it should be. It's just it's what allows the human creativity to really flourish. And it's the creativity that's coming from wholeness rather than from a limited sense of egoic self. So there's an unlimited potential of creativity that can flow out of the transcending of the egoic self. I met an artist in Ashfield, North Carolina. Can't remember his name, but if you're there, just ask anybody for the meditating artist, and they'll point you in his direction. And he meditates for hours before he does a piece of art. And he was talking about the process and how he kind of just, you know, transcends the self that seeks approval for his art, and he had all these kind of archetype selves that he described that he had transcended over the years, and how his creativity flowed differently as these aspects of the self fell away. And so that's art, creativity flowing from the whole, from the unlimited potential of the whole. That can express itself. Life can express itself as us, and can be through our creativity can be expressed through human creativity.
Just listening to Jason and Stephen talk about the control and stuff, I just came with a simile that without being too deterministic, but it's a bit like if you were the teeth in a gear. Just because you show up at a certain time, things happen. But no teeth and no gear would ever dream about being in control of the mechanism. But just because they show up, things happen. And if the teeth shows up, the wheel will go. But if the teeth doesn't show up, the other wheel will not go. So I was trying to come to that distinction between changing and making things happen without being in control. And that, as Stephen said, sometimes it may appear to be contradictory. So I was trying to look for an example, and I came up with here. I'll think about it a bit more.
Thank you. Giovanni?
Just a quick comment that may help. There is a little clip by the Dalai Lama that I sent to Johanna. I don't know if it was circulated. That is in his typical, very clear and direct way, kind of addressed some of these issues. And in it, he gives he talks about again having this karma from so many causes and conditions converging into where he is now, and of course over which he had most of which he had no control over, including the current causes and conditions that brought to him to where he was at the moment. And then he said, but then, we have this wonderful ability as human beings, this wonderful gift of course, the intellect and creativity. I actually use the term creativity as well. And we observe all this, and of course, with all of the rights that, of course, he already embodies and knows about, morality, right intent, right wisdom, and so forth. Then he has the clarity that you were mentioning before, Stephen, and that drives his next step, his next action. Doesn't mean control, but it does mean everything else. That he has that clarity and he takes the step in very often in the right direction.
Mhm.
And it's very, very direct. It's only 3 minutes, 4 minutes.
Thank you.
Stephen, I've been finding this discussion really, really interesting. The line between we have no control, but we're being part of the cosmic conditions, which shifts what happens next, and we're more than passive observers. And of course, this is touching on the issues of free will and stuff that we've had long discussions about. And you'll probably tell me that I'm just trying to figure out intellectually something which can't be figured, understood intellectually at all. But I'm trying to come up with some possible explanations, at least possibilities of what might be going on here. And I have read that from the Christian mystic traditions, at least some people say that it's often the case that there's the thought that when you get the self out of the way, you're not God, you're not the divine, but you're opening yourself to letting the God and the divine act through you. But in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, there's more an idea that when you get the self out of the way, you realize that you're part of the divine, you're part of God. And so I'm just wondering, is a possible explanation here? And again, I understand this is going on the intellectual path, but that when you get the self out of the way, you're just letting life unfold. And you're actually part of life. And so even though you're not in control as such, you're part of life orienting itself or leading in a certain direction. So, which is almost a little bit of controlling sort of future directions and future changes, or is that kind of thinking just going down a pointless path?
Well, to talk about what you said, the last bit there, we can see how we cause suffering for ourselves, right? Through our identifications, attachments. That's part of the practice. That's part of the Four Noble Truths. Seeing the cause of how we cause suffering through craving and clinging. So there's a cause and effect. It's an action, reaction. And seeing how when we don't cling and crave, the dukkha, which is translated as suffering, doesn't arise. So again, there's a cause and effect there. So we're seeing it. We're not controlling it, but we're seeing that this is what happens. And when we see that, we can say, okay, the seeing allows us to recognize when we're doing something that's going to cause suffering. So we don't do it anymore. we see that that causes suffering. And through that continual seeing, we see that it's this clinging to this identification with an egoic self that's actually motivating the clinging and the craving. It's this sense of self separation. So we can see that, and then that can fall away. So then what are you left with? You've in a sense, you've done some recognizing and seeing. I won't say controlling, but there's a real element of recognizing and seeing how things are unfolding, how suffering unfolds, how the cessation of suffering arises. And you're seeing how things arise based on causes and conditions, causing one thing, causing another. When you see that, and the self, the identification with the self falls away, then you can see how what you do in the world has these consequences, these effects. And you continually see that, right? We're constantly talking about in spiritual teachings about cause and effect. So there is cause and effect that's occurring. And we're part of that cause and effect unfolding. In terms of the perhaps the difference between Eastern teachings and Western spiritual teachings, there's a fundamental difference, and I think our whole notion of not accepting ourselves, or let's just stick with ourselves, not accepting aspects of ourselves could come from that deep thinking that, well, we're somehow flawed, right? That we're somehow there's evil within us, and that we're somehow flawed. And this, could go back to the story of Genesis and the eating the apple and so on, and punishment for such, being conscious of our flaws. That's not in Eastern religions. The Eastern religions say suffering happens because of misperception of who we truly are. You think you're the separate self, it's just a big misperception. It's a misunderstanding. Once you see that, you'll realize you're one with the whole, with the absolute, with Buddha nature. You'll see that, and suffering ceases. So very different kind of ways of coming at who we really are. Now, of course, Christian mystics have gone and studied Buddhism and Hinduism, and a lot of them have integrated. Thomas Merton, who's a good example. A lot of this is kind of a melding of teachings. Jason shared with me a Zen teacher who was, I can't remember, whose teacher was Elaine, I can't remember her last name, who was a Catholic nun who went and lived in Japan and became a Zen teacher. So now she's a Catholic. They call her Reverend Sister Elaine, because because in Zen they use the word reverend, but so she's got these two. So she's teaching about God, but from a Zen perspective, and it's a very interesting kind of melding that's happening as well as the world, as we communicate and travel and so on. There's this melding of spiritual traditions that are occurring. It's actually a very exciting time to be involved in spiritual paths and spiritual teaching because of that. So some of the Christian mystics are coming from that. It's some integration of Eastern teachings as well. I'll just end it there. Another good idea for a session. Again, perhaps a more intellectual, as you said, session, but that can be helpful at times. So we're out of time, and Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'll think about the creativity angle as a potential topic for next session, the role of human creativity and no self. What is creativity with no self? So something that comes at that angle. And an interesting topic is really looking at some of how the Christian mystics are teaching no self, how that's seeping into some of the, well, not just contemporary. Eckhart, Meister Eckhart really taught no self, in the last, decades ago. So it's not new. That could be another way to explore this if people are interested in that topic as well. Yeah. So great to see everyone. Take care and be well. And hope to see you next week.
Well, creativity no self is when you do a painting and then you don't sign it.